Welcome everyone for another Rising Tide lecture, which is part of our symposium, The Role of Art in Shaping a Sovereign Citizenry, which will go on from January 15th until March 12th. Today we have Rising Tide Director Matt Ehret, who will be doing a presentation, The Art of Political Freedom, Thomas Cole's Course of Empire and the Hudson River School, which is a subject that is surprisingly very controversial and was one of the center battlegrounds of cultural warfare in the United States in the 19th century. Since the United States didn't have so much of a musical scene or a dramatic scene on the stage, it was mostly waged through literature and also painting. So Matt is going to go through this very important subject today, and I'll just let him take it off.
Thank you so kindly, Cynthia, and thank you everyone for joining us on this Sunday afternoon. We're here in Montreal, or south of Montreal. We are in a bit of a snowstorm, so putting that on the record now is a bit of a disclaimer in case things go awry technically. That's why. So hopefully we do get a smooth sleigh ride through this digital landscape. And that brings up the question of landscape paintings, because we are in a situation today where there's an inability to sort of see beyond the senses of things. People's minds have been shaped by types of cultural matrices that have overinflated certain components of the human condition without striking the proper balance between how our senses, which we're all born with, thank God, interface with our minds. So either you get people who get a little bit too logic heavy, and they tend to only operate on ivory tower ideologies of the way their logic heavy abstractions construct the way they believe the world or human nature should be, without any regards to the empirical evidence of what the universe shows us human nature and the universe itself actually are. Or inversely, we get other categories of people who get a little bit too dominated by the emotions that arise purely from the five senses, right? Which are constantly hitting us as a wave all the time. Our five senses are constantly being struck with sights, with sounds, with smells, with taste, with feelings that can sometimes cause us to fall into a mode of fear, where our mind is not properly able to temper itself to think creatively, or anger and rage unnecessarily based upon certain sensory data that we're given. And there's a lot of reasons to be afraid, a lot of reasons to be angry. I'm not trying to discount those things, but we can't ever be dominated by them. And so this inability to sort of see the dance of senses and mind, the mind which judges the input from the senses and discovers qualities, whereas senses are just constantly quantitatively flooding us with vibrations, right? Sound waves, light waves, chemical material that have electrical impulses that we feed through our nerves and through our various things that we've only scratched the surface of into our brains, which we can then judge qualitatively. Okay, that's my cat. That's Cynthia's voice over Jerry's voice, even though sound waves are just sound waves. So I can discover these qualities that are more than the sum of their parts. I can even think of higher qualities like justice, like freedom, which I can't really smell or see or taste or touch, but I can still get a concept of them. So how can our ability to judge our senses be refined to the point that we can get better and better internalized concepts and of things that are very important, without the which we could not really exist as a species, like justice, like freedom, such that when it's removed from us, we can act accordingly to prevent its removal, or we can defend it and make it better for ourselves and for future generations. So this idea of painting as a medium of cultural warfare is something that I think a lot of people have not been introduced to. I myself have a background in the arts, to a certain degree. I studied fine arts in university. I also hold on one second. Just got a little problem here. I studied I studied arts in university, illustration, fine arts. But it wasn't until more later in life that I realized just how much of a battleground this was, and how much in the 19th century, the question of whether or not the Republic would even be able to exist, let alone survive throughout the 18th and into the 19th century and beyond, it was a question of the arts and culture. So that's only something I've more recently discovered in the course of this current presentation I'm about to deliver, which may be broken up into two. I don't know. I have a lot of gratitude for the writings of a figure who's an elderly gentleman who co-wrote some of the Untold History of Canada, at least Volume 1, named Pierre Baudry, who did some remarkable work on this topic of aesthetics, and specifically the American school of painting that emerged around the Hudson River School. But this class is going to be a lot more than that. So I'm going to do a little screen share here. Can people see, first of all, can people still hear my voice okay? Or is the snowstorm disrupting the, yeah, it's all good? Okay. All right. So the title, as people know, of this particular presentation is The Art of Political Freedom, Thomas Cole's Course of Empire in the Hudson River School. What's wrong with my screen? I did maximize it. Oh, I didn't. Cynthia reminded me that I can do this, which I forgot. So now we have a maximized screen. As I mentioned, the question of art, both poetry, literature, as we saw from Cynthia's presentation 2 weeks ago and from Jerry's presentation last week, and especially painting, have a role in educating the citizenry on a deep level that allows us to judge right and wrong in a way that other modes of teaching don't really allow, in terms of just, classes on the logic of right and wrong, the philosophy of justice. From a purely philosophical standpoint, there's a limit to what these modes of teaching and communicating can do, which the arts are unconstrained by. So before we begin, there's a character who plays a very important role in the formation of what was known as the Hudson River School of Painting. This character's name is James Fenimore Cooper, and he was a second-generation American patriot. His father was an officer in Washington's army, and a great industrialist, a developer of land. His father founded the Cooperstown in New York State, and was a strong believer in the idea of a manifest destiny, of the idea that the best of human civilization, irregardless of ethnicity or anything of the sort, but the best of civilization could be and must be carried forth to be made better and better and better, as the founding documents of the United States outlined in strong detail, that here for the first time was a nation founded upon the rejection of hereditary institutions, but more importantly upon the idea that all people are sovereign, that the nation's laws are premised around the consent of the governed, and the well-being both of the sacredness of the individual, but the general welfare of the whole. So those are very strong and important guidelines that apply to every civilization, every culture, and every religion you could imagine. That's always going to be true. That a society is based upon natural law to the degree that those conditions are being improved upon and defended. The problem is always that there is such a thing as oligarchy. And just like today, there has always been this stubborn phenomenon of oligarchical hereditary systems which have certain continuous modes of behavior, certain methods of seeing themselves, trying to see nature, trying to see their victims, and getting their victims to enslave themselves, undermine their own sovereignty, their own freedoms. And this goes back to the days of ancient Athens, ancient Greece, ancient Egypt. We see evidence of the battle against this system. In the case of ancient Greece, there's a famous classical Greek play called Prometheus Bound by Aeschylus, which outlined, I think, in the clearest way imaginable, the two conditions. Everyone knows, I would imagine, the play Prometheus, Prometheus Bound. We've lost the first and the third of the trilogy by Aeschylus. But essentially, in this one part, the second part of the series by Aeschylus that has been preserved, it's the story of Prometheus, a demigod who sees in mankind something that is more than the sensual behavior which the mortals are projecting. The mortals being creatures who don't know the use of fire. They're the playthings of the gods. They're living in the dirt. But he sees potential. He sees something more there. And so he disobeys the law of Zeus. One of the key laws that Zeus has laid out in this story is that man must never have, the mortals must never be granted the knowledge of the gods, specifically the knowledge of the use of fire and the consequences of fire that pertain to the sciences, the arts, chemistry, animal husbandry, poetry, any of those things which Aeschylus develops in his story, that cannot be made known to the mind of the mortals. Aeschylus chooses to disobey, defy Zeus's law, steals that fire, shares it with humankind, and with that, we have the advent of human history as it was understood in allegorical language by the Greeks. And even though obviously this is not 100% scientific, the principle is definitely sound. And we see evidence of these two different opposing paradigms of seeing mankind as he is versus as he could be, he or she could be. And I say mankind in the broadest sense here. I should say humankind. So this is what people like Benjamin Franklin, who was known as the Prometheus of America, when he discovered the fire of the gods and shared it with men. And with that, his concepts of political liberty were found much greater root as they were tied to his idea of a scientific revolution. Now, the problem was, as everyone I think here knows, the American Revolution was never finalized. There was always efforts to subvert it from within. So James Fenimore Cooper's father, William Cooper, was a great defender of the right of the nation and of the people to exist and to preserve their institutions and to make them grow and improve. William Cooper was a member of the Congress. He was also, it appears, likely assassinated by forces affiliated with Aaron Burr in 1809. It's a topic of a longer discussion. The same forces who had killed Alexander Hamilton just a little bit earlier. And James Fenimore Cooper is known as an author of fiction books. Last of the Mohicans, Leatherstocking Tales, that's typically what he's known for. But he was actually, it is known as the inspiration, along with a couple of other key figures, of the American Hudson River School of painting. Now, one of the points that Fenimore Cooper wrote in his American Democrat, he wrote a lot of nonfiction books as well as fiction books. And a lot of the fiction books that he did write, the most important ones are the least known today, although they were the most known and appreciated in the 19th century, which we're going to cite a few of those, especially on the nature and evil of Venice and Venice's global intelligence operations. But in this particular pamphlet called The American Democrat, which he wrote in opposition to the corruption of the Andrew Jacksonian mob rule ethic that was really starting to basically make the people of America go increasingly nuts, as there was a very, very racist redefinition of manifest destiny that was infused, that involved the crushing of the natives, the destruction of many of the First Nations peoples, and the destruction of a lot of the institutions that America needed to survive and fight back against this oligarchy. So he wrote to the people saying, whenever the government of the United States shall break up, it will probably be in consequence of a false direction, having been given to it will probably be in consequence of a false direction having been given to public opinion. This is the weak point of our defenses, and the part to which the enemies of the system will direct all of their attacks. Opinion can be so perverted as to cause the false to seem true, the enemy a friend, and the friend an enemy, the best interests of the nation to appear insignificant, and trifles of the moment. In a word, the right, the wrong, and the wrong, the right. In a country where opinion has sway, to seize upon it is to seize upon power, as it is a rule of humanity that the upright and well-intentioned are comparatively passive, while the designing, dishonest, and selfish are the most untiring in their efforts, The danger of public opinions getting a false direction is fourfold, since few men think for themselves. So these are very prescient remarks that I think are as applicable today as they were back when he said them. From the previous class in my series, I introduced Benjamin West, Ben Franklin's ally, who became the leader, co-founder, and the president of the British Royal Academy of Fine Arts, and who trained Samuel B. Morse. So West, the American Pennsylvanian painter, trained Samuel B. Morse, who studied in Britain, and both waged a war to try to uplift the aesthetical principles in Britain itself, in the heart of the beast, which he did to a certain degree quite in an interesting way, although that was subverted. But then to bring the best principles of classical knowledge as well as aesthetics to humanity, this challenge was given to Morse, who carried on this fight to create a new school in America with the foundation of the National Academy of Design that he co-founded with a fellow named Thomas Cole in 1825, in order to carry out and to try to deal with this problem of the corruption of the morals and the corruption of popular opinion that was really underway, especially after the ouster of John Quincy Adams. And, Samuel B. Morse said it very clearly. He said in a lecture, he said, "It becomes a question of some importance whether it be not possible to lay the foundations of a just taste in the fine arts of our country on such principles that a substantial fabric may rise in as beautiful proportions as the temple of our political constitution. That the foundation may be strong, it should be laid not in authority, however ancient, but in the never-changing principles of nature. Authority in all its forms usurps the place of truth and reason." This is one of the examples, even though Samuel B. Morse is known as somebody who led in the development of telegraphs, what became electric-based communication. Morse code is something, obviously, that got its name from Morse. He was also, as I pointed out, he studied under Ben West, and he was one of the greatest painters of his day. This is one of the displays that we spent a lot of time in my last lecture looking at, of a painting that he did on the gallery at the Louvre, featuring none other, many people that he knew, including his late daughter, who was a refined painter as well. But over there is none other than Cooper himself, James Fenimore Cooper, with his daughter, and a few other key allies. Now, none of the stuff that we see here, the paintings and the various styles, exist in the same room in the Louvre. They're all spread out, but Morse went out of his way to place them all here to really get across that even though that America needs, in its early inception, to have a strong culture to keep pace with the love of technological progress, knowing that if technological progress was dislodged from the growth of the evolution and improvement of culture, then you could always have it used for tyrannical ends. As we don't need too many examples to be persuaded of that, I believe, looking at our present day and where it's at. So this is always understood that you have to have a co-development of both in order for science and technology to be properly used for the benefit of the greater good and each individual. So this had to be something which, even though not every American could go to the Louvre in this sense could come to America, but also with a spirit that was not really available in the cultural matrices of Europe, pre-Napoleonic or Napoleonic or post-Napoleonic. There wasn't really this extra Promethean spark within the systems of hereditary power that had dominated Europe. So, knowing that the Hudson River School and Thomas Cole's series of paintings is a big part of today's presentation, I mentioned that Cooper, James Fenimore, was a key inspiration for this. The spirit of manifest destiny, the opening up of the new world, the leaping over the limits to growth was another component of this. And I say this when I say manifest destiny, I hope people know that I don't mean the Jackson racist view of it, which has been applied to great destruction, both of our own morals, but also the livelihoods of other people. The imperial view, the Pax Americana view of the right to impose one civilization onto others and crush the so-called inferior savage civilizations because we have the right to rule over the weak, right? This Nietzschean Hobbesian view of manifest destiny is not what I'm talking about. It's not what Schiller was talking about in his writings, although he does talk about this type of spirit. Neither was Alexander von Humboldt, a close friend of Schiller, talking about this, although he was talking about opening up mega infrastructure projects, water projects, even rail development across South America and the Americas as a whole. He wasn't talking about this idea of suppressing other cultures, but rather finding a harmony of cultures under a higher universality of improving the conditions of life for all of us with a focus on the mind. So these three, I think, were sort of the godfathers, the spiritual godfathers of the new cultural movements around the Hudson River School, but also around the School of Science, which had also co-evolved with the Hudson River School. As I pointed out, the fact that Morse was also a scientist and a painter was not a coincidence. Alexander Humboldt was a painter. He did many of his own drafts and paintings of foliage of new species that he discovered himself. Schiller, obviously a poet, but was also a scientist, did scientific experiments with Goethe on light, on optics, with Wilhelm and Alexander von Humboldt. These guys were creating a cultural matrix of real Promethean science and culture. So I want to begin with a few selections of Schiller's writing on where it's the only writing that I know of where he speaks about the challenge of painting, and specifically landscape painting. So we're going to run through a few of these. So there's a paradox. Schiller says, if we understand poetry or painting in general as the art of putting us into specific emotional states by means of the free action of our productive powers of imagination, a definition which certainly holds its own against the many others in circulation on this topic, we come up with two requirements which no poet may shirk, if he wishes to be deserving of the name. First, he must permit the free play and self-activity of our own imaginative powers, and second, he must be no less certain of achieving his intended effect upon us, arousing within us a determinate emotion. These two requirements may initially seem mutually contradictory, since according to the first, our own imaginative powers must rule and must obey none other than their own law, whereas according to the second, those powers must serve and obey the poet's law. How then does the poet resolve this contradiction? By prescribing to our imagination no other course but that which it would have had to take in full freedom and according to its own laws, such that the poet's purpose is achieved through nature, thereby transforming external into internal necessity. Essentially, that is the key problem, right? That is the key thing. If you're an artist, you know that you have a power over those who give admiration to your art. You have a power, thus you have a responsibility. But you have a responsibility not to be stupid about it and to have also refined yourself to a state where you actually know what is in the health of your own soul. You can't be somebody who has skipped steps and thinks that their self-interest is in subverting others who are weaker than me in order to gain for myself. That's a false sense of self-interest, which actually creates more insecurity for yourself in the long run, and probably more deeper unhappiness in the long run too for yourself and your forebears or people to come after you. So Schiller's like, okay, the artist has to both be able to have an effect which is determined within their audience, but also the audience has to have the free ability within themselves. You can't be forced to come to a conclusion. You have to be able to freely come to your own discoveries on your own. You can't be manipulated. That's a big challenge because we all know what examples of propaganda art look like, right? There's enough examples of that, which clearly just want to manipulate to get an effect, but it's not very free. It's manipulative. We also know we also can probably think of some examples of mindless art, which have no intention, but they just get effects. It's kind of sloppy. So, but this is not what Schiller's talking about. He goes on. He says, whenever the poet becomes unable to guide our own imaginative play by means of an internal necessity, either he must guide it externally, in which case it is no longer our action. Think example, the propaganda examples that I gave you. There's a lot of propaganda art. So that's forced, it's manipulative, it's not our action. Or he does not guide it at all, in which case it ceases to be his action. And yet both coexist side by side in a work of art, if we were to call it poetry. I'm going to run out of time, so I have to skip ahead. All right. So there's a few examples of landscape painting that Schiller gets at. You have landscape painting, which is developed. We don't have too many examples of this going back to ancient times, but in the Renaissance period, we do have examples of some landscape painting, but it tends to be in the background. The Mona Lisa has a beautiful landscape in the background. It's a wonderful landscape using, I should have taken a picture of it, but aerial perspective is worked on very much by Da Vinci. We see some example of aerial perspective here, which is essentially the increased density of the atmosphere, which causes the colors to fade as they move further away from a point of observation, right? The forms become less legible due to the atmosphere, especially on like a very damp day or a foggy day, obviously. So we see an example here in Rembrandt of a bit of aerial perspective, a little bit of a landscape, but obviously the focus is not the landscape. The focus is the abduction of Europa, which is a story from Ovid's Metamorphosis. There you have an ox representing Zeus, who's abducting Europa for, basically he's Zeus, just like Aeschylus gets across. He's an irrationalist, oligarchist, impulsive character who's got a libido that's, that's impossible to rein in because he's an immortal. He should not be reined in by anything, says the Zeuses of Olympus, the ones who are today trying to kick around managing a great reset, or the ones of the past trying to manage the great resets of ancient Rome and ancient Greece. So that's one example. But again, the focus is the actual characters in front of us. Go to the other extreme, okay? So let's bounce for extremes. Here's another extreme type of display of some modern, I would say nice-looking landscapes. Can't say anything bad about them, but the purpose is the landscape. One couldn't find necessarily more than what we see as far as a nice conveyance of colors, of lights. You got a little bit of aerial perspective in some of them here too. But it's essentially, it is what it is. It's not too complicated. It's straightforward. So it's not going to really engage the mind to think about, well, what does the author want us to think? The authors probably want us to think about whatever we want, right? Just have a nice emotion. Here you go. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. And let's look at a medium ground one. Here's an example of Claude Lorrain, who in many ways was an inspiration as well for the American Hudson River School. His paintings are fantastic. 17th century French painter. In this case, the story is the marriage of Isaac and Rebecca, a Bible story. But it's obviously not the key focus. This is a very, it almost has like a Dutch secular sort of feel to it. There's a little bit of dancing going on after a marriage. People are just enjoying themselves. And then you have the landscape. The landscape is taking on more of a presence here. There's some characters in the back coming up to the foreground. But it's not like as grandiose as Rembrandt's. And it's not as subdued as the basic landscapes we saw here. It's a bit of a middle ground. So we got different choices, different approaches to take. Just getting at zeroing in on what Schiller's trying to say. I don't think any of them really satisfy entirely the type of high ideal that Schiller is putting forth for the poet or the artist, but I think that they're still good examples of things zeroing in on the type of thought he has. But let's go a little bit more. And I'm sorry, if I might have to cut this class into two. I'm looking at my watch here, but I'll try not to. We'll see. He says here, he describes the two pathways available for the landscape artist. He says that there exist two routes by which inanimate nature can come to symbolize human nature, either as a representation of emotions or as a representation of ideas. So he's saying basically you can't cut completely, since art comes from the human. You can't necessarily sever, as much as one might wish to sever the product from the creation. One can't really do it. And because art is designed for the appreciation of humans, and it will shape in turn humans, you always have to have an awareness that the object of the art itself and the subject of the creative subjective artist and the audience, who is also subjective with their own internal hearts and minds, have to all be taken into consideration with art. You can't put these artificial barriers between object and subject. Schiller has other places where he describes the same type of problem in political science, which tries to get us into an ivory tower separation of theoreticians and academicians, thinking about models of the world without thinking about the world itself subjectively, and science, which are really, you can't separate the scientist trying to discover creation from the creation being discovered. Anybody who does that walks into a trap. So the arts are not immune from this. There should always be the harmonization of both. So you can express these human qualities in a variety of ways. There's a lot of ways to do this, but you could represent via the emotions or via ideas, concepts that can be, a little bit, you could describe as maybe more logical thoughts. But is it just logic? Or is Schiller's idea of ideas based on purely abstract logic, or is it something else? And is it detached from emotions? Certainly not. So he describes here, we may regard every pictorial or poetic composition as a species of music. So he's not afraid to leap in and out of different types of arts, right? Which to some extent can be subjected to the same laws. We demand that the painter's colors have tone and harmony, and even something resembling modulation. In every poem, we recognize a distinction between its unity of thought and its unity of emotion, between its musical attitude and its logical construction. Obviously, Schiller did not get to live through the age of postmodernism, so that was to come later. He was not himself too tainted by some of the postmodernist theories of art, but he was going at it from the standpoint of, okay, we have harmonies, we have balance, we have tones, except that, the space of music is a space of the audio, but there's still frequencies, there's still harmonics. And the space of paintings is the space of light, still frequencies, still harmonics of light will be found. It's just that the speed at which those waves move in the light domain are much faster than the audio, but we find examples of that are very similar, let's just say that. And also how the thought expresses itself as it develops in a musical piece, right? You start with a theme and you develop it, you move it. Is it broken? Is it disjointed? Or is there a harmony of the parts to the whole? Is there a harmony of the stanzas of a poem to the whole, or is it broken up and disjointed? Same thing for a painting. These are all perfectly viable questions. He says, but there is a second route. So beyond emotions, by which a landscape painter can be brought within humanity's purview. So after he talked about the development of emotions and how painters who are sensitive to emotions are painting the soul. They're not just painting color; they're painting the soul. But the question then is, are those painters who are sensitive to this reality themselves painting the soul in a destructive or a constructive way? You're affecting the souls of your audience. Are you doing it to make them better or to make them worse? To make them more inclined with death and destruction of their potential, or enhanced? Which one are you doing? So he says here, okay, to continue to explore that, there's a second route by which landscape nature can be brought within humanity's purview, namely by having it become an expression of ideas. By ideas, however, we definitely do not mean whatever is aroused as the result of accidental associations. Such a practice is arbitrary and altogether unworthy of art. Rather, we mean those ideas which necessarily proceed from the lawful operations of our imaginative powers. Within active souls awakened to the feeling of their own moral dignity, reason is by no means a passive observer in the interplay of imagination. Rather, it unceasingly strives to reconcile this accidental interplay with its own operations. So, imagination. How can you work both reason and imagination together in a lawful way? That's another challenge here. I got a few short ones now, and then we'll get into some paintings, I promise. Now, he says here that the composer and the landscape poet and artist achieves this effect solely by means of the form of their representation, and they merely attune the mind to certain types of emotions and ideas. It is left to the listener or observer's own imaginative powers to discern a content therein. So you have to leave it to the observer to have the free decision to take what they can and generate what they do from your creative product. So the artist may hint at those ideas in the painting. He may allude to the emotions, but he must never lay them out explicitly, lest he encroach upon the reader's own imaginative powers. So in that sense, if you consider what I'm doing right now art, I might be considered as doing maybe bad art because I'm being a little bit literal. Now he's basically saying, but it's the type of class sort of demands it as far as I could tell for the moment. But he's saying that you cannot, to be truthful, you can't be literal. That seems like a paradox for a literalist, right? You have to leave the space to the artist, to the person appreciating your art, receiving your art. Whatever actual and explicit content the poet does incorporate will always remain finite. The potential content which he leaves us to fill in is infinitely great. So here Schiller is basically giving another paradox, that the artist is somebody who is consciously placing something within us. So you're using a finite medium. A painting is a finite medium, right? Everything you're portraying, you can't portray an infinite concept like justice. You can portray acts that are just or less just, but you can't portray justice as it is. You could portray flowers, but you can't portray the idea of flowerness. You can't do that. There's just infinite types of flowers you can portray on a lower level. So you're using finiteness, but you're placing something in the heart of the viewer or listener of music. But that something that you're placing, utilizing finiteness, is designed to be infinite. So it's kind of like the story of what do you put into a barrel of water that will make it less heavy, right? What do you most things you would add would make it heavier. And people probably know the answer to this. That I think everyone's heard this before. It's a hole. You add a hole into the bottle of water. By adding the hole, the barrel becomes lighter. But here's a type of thing you're adding into the heart of the viewer, or the art experiencer, that is not making them less. It's actually it's being put there as a controlled ambiguity, as a controlled irony, in order for them to fill it themselves with something that isn't finite. What they're filling is something which has the character of infinitely great, of infiniteness. He always selects his objects as a complex of phenomena existing in time rather than in space. This is the case of the poet here. And he favors nature in motion over nature which is fixed and at rest. Before our eyes, he unfolds her eternally changing drama, and her various phenomena are made to flow into each other with the most appealing, continuous harmony. Okay. All right. Okay, so what's just happened here is something a bit inconvenient, but my entire PowerPoint has broken down. Okay, so just as I was about to go into the paintings, the PowerPoint is broken down, which means I have to think about what to do here. Let me do a stop share. Okay. All right. Okay, let's hope it doesn't sabotage again. All right. So I want to show a quick display here. I cut out a bunch of quotes to make this class move a little bit faster. So what we see here is a painting. It's a obvious landscape. It's done by Thomas Cole in 1830. I want to say 36. My memory is failing me a bit here. It might be 1838. And this painting, and keep in mind, Thomas Cole worked very closely with Samuel B. Morse in founding the National Academy of Design as being the instrument for the Humboldt Schiller aesthetical movement in culture in America. He also worked very closely with James Fenimore Cooper, both in America, carrying out cultural warfare, but also in France, in England. I went through this at length in my last class on the topic of painting. But James Fenimore Cooper was in France at the time of Marquis de Lafayette, who had his second chance at achieving a proper American Revolution outcome in France after he failed in 1789, failing to declare himself president as he had to do, and instead going along with supporting an idiot king who was himself just a tool of the oligarchy. And by Marquis de Lafayette missing his second chance in 1830, the hope for all of Europe, which had been prepared for a Republican revolution, was overturned. And all of these greats, Morse was there, Cooper was there, Cole was there, all organizing. Edgar Allan Poe was also there, as I developed in an earlier class. It was a wide network. And they were being coordinated by people like Alexander von Humboldt as well, who was very active in trying to create this new age of reason and brotherhood for humankind as a whole, as was originally attempted in 1776 with Franklin's international conspiracy. So again, these are people who are not just artists for art's sake. They're people who are profound citizens engaged in a battle with evil. And so their displays always have to be looked at from that standpoint of what is their intention, what is in their heart, what are they doing, what are they trying to say, without literally saying it, because they're not literalists, as they listen to Schiller. So here's a painting. It's called The Savage State, and it's done by Cole, like I said. Oops. And what you see here is a mountain. You see some people hunting. There's some examples of some teepee, a little bonfire going on. There's some canoes in a stream, pretty disorganized. It's an untamed wilderness in many ways. And you could say this is a beautiful painting by itself, but Schiller also pointed out that great art should always involve change. Now you have motion, you got some wind, you got people running. That's a type of change, but it's not really transformative change, because you could change in place. That's quantitative change. But you can't really change. But to change in quality is a different thing. I don't think one could say that this painting would particularly qualitatively change the viewer. But this painting is not a painting that's a standalone. He painted this within the context of a 5-part series. So part 2, and these were all displayed together. So you have to be sort of in the mind of somebody in 1830s America, having spent whatever it is, 50 cents to look and think about what is the message that's not quite literal. Second part of his series, he called Pastoral State. You have sort of one of these idealized situations of an early society. You got some Druidic, Stonehenge over there. You got shepherds in the background, some sailboats. A philosopher that looks a little bit like it might be, Archimedes doing geometric work in the sand with a stick. You got some child playing with a loving mom, a couple of children, some people dancing in the background with a lute, another shepherd, right? A boat being constructed. So it's a pastoral state. There's a little bit more order in nature. It still has a nice balance of wilderness and order. But that's part 2. Part 3, he just leaps ahead.
Sorry, can you go back one more step? Go back to the first of those 2.
Yes. Oh, 2?
Yeah, one more.
There.
Oh, is that the same mountain?
That's the same mountain.
Okay, got it. That's what I wanted to know. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, that's the same mountain. So, and that's the same mountain there again. There's a second mountain in the background that's going to be also important later on in resolving the ambiguity. But just keep that in mind. Then there's that same mountain again. And this is called the consummation. So this is the state where the empire has really it's really come to its peaks of luxury, of affluence. And I mean, these are huge paintings, right? These are like almost murals. They're not murals, but almost. They're huge. And the level of depth and detail, there's so much going on here. What's interesting is that you can't say which empire this is, because there's some Doric architecture, there's some Corinthian architecture, there's some Ionian, there's some Greek, some Roman architecture. There's a little bit of French architecture in there too. So this is not anything that you could say Thomas Cole has seen with his eyes. He hasn't, right? He's creating, using his imagination, a situation that involves a sort of ambiguity. Because which empire is he talking about that has now reached its max of affluence and it's party central? I mean, there's a lot going on. There's an elephant coming in, marching inward over this Napoleonic style bridge. You have, there's a lot happening. So this is an empire. It's an underdefined empire. But that's only part 3, because part 4, things get bad. Things get dark. The weather is terrible, obviously. We still see that same mountain in the background. The columns are destroyed. It's hell, right? People are being killed left and right. There's obviously like Viking-style boats coming in. Hard to tell who's on what side. Chaos. And obviously, based upon the type of statue here, which didn't exist in the previous one, we know that the society values certain warlike things in this state. We also know that this society has a little bit of a problem with not just decadence, but also with slavery. I mean, these columns were known as the Atlantes of theater. They represented the bondages of slavery. I had a little note here. It was originally designed in Persian times, having a full body, with the head acting as the column supporting a structure. They say here it was designed. It was known as the Atlantes of the theater of Dionysius or Telamon. And anyway, it usually denoted servitude and slavery of people who had been captured in battle. And whether it was women or whether it was other slaves, we saw the same sort of thing also in Egypt as a sign of the dominant nation who was victorious in winning over their slaves by destroying their enemy, as, sort of having a trophy in the form of the columns as human people. So this is a society which is now really gone the way of what appears to be the Roman Empire. Right? The fires in the background, it's destruction. And that's actually what it's called. It's called destruction. And then finally, part 5 of the part series is desolation. Nature is really just coming back right now. There's only the faintest hints of a past great civilization. So the question is, like, it was called The Course of Empire. What was Cole's intention? Was he basically gloating over the fact that all civilization is cyclical and America, just like every other civilization, was necessarily going to become another failed state, another empire? America wasn't really acting like an empire back then, right? That's something that happened later on as it slid into corruption. But what was he saying? That this is defined, that this is going to happen? Or was it more of a warning? Also, is there a solution, right? Unless what happens? What would be the solution to this type of outcome, which we wouldn't want to have happen, even though it's happened so many times before? So just open questions, right? There are some ambiguities in there. A lot of people didn't know what to think about this, but it was very popular because it was executed so well. Some people did think he was being like cynical, being anti-American by trying to condemn America as being like just another empire, even though it hadn't been that yet. Some people saw it as a warning. I think that's what it was. So let's continue on. I want to just contrast this with another example of somebody who does something similar in Britain. And this is somebody who's going to play a very big role in the evolution of all of the art world in a I would say a rather destructive way.
Now, about 20 years before Thomas Cole did his 5-part series, a fellow by the name of Turner did a 2-part series on the rise and fall of Carthage. That's explicitly what it's called. This is Dido, the mythical founder of Carthage from around 800 BC, constructing or leading in the construction of Carthage. Today's Tunisia was the center capital. North of Africa was sort of Carthage. It came from a Phoenician civilization. Tyre was a big part of this in ancient times. And sorry, just looking at my notes here. And so James Turner portrayed the construction of it in 1815. This is around the time of the Congress of Vienna. The Napoleonic Wars had just ended. Napoleon was put down. You had, again, like I said, the Congress of Vienna was sort of the restoration of the oligarchical system under Lord Castlereagh, Lord Metternich. The enemies of Schiller and Humboldt had taken a dominant position in Europe at this time. The greatest threat to the world order was seen as love of freedom that had given rise to the revolutionary tendencies of the French Revolution, which turned into the Napoleonic Wars. And basically, this is where the oligarchical structures all got together and they said, okay, we're going to have something new. We're going to crush anything that smells of freedom. This painting that Turner did at a very young age was celebrated widely. And you're like, why would he be? What's up with this? Well, is there anything weird about this? There's nice painting. I don't see anything wrong with it explicitly. And part 2 is the decline of Carthage and its fall. Now, he didn't paint it in a there's no chaos going on, right? It's kind of similar to the consummation of Thomas Cole, part 3 of the 5-part series. I see, people enjoying themselves. There's obviously been a little bit of partying, some instruments, flowers, mother with her baby. People are having a pleasant time. And he calls it the decline and fall of Carthage. Now, this is a message. It's taken as a message. He composes it as a bit of a message, a warning as well for the British Empire that he is beholden to not fall the way of Carthage. This is an age, where the question of whether empires will endure is very underdefined. Now, I would say that this is a troublesome painting because if you know the history of Rome and Carthage through the 3 Punic Wars, this becomes very questionable, since the alliance that Rome had with Carthage was a 250-year alliance, which had largely kept a lot of the oligarchical hordes that had managed to control operations throughout the Persian Empire, all the way up. We know what Alexander the Great, through Cynthia's wonderful class, was up against, was what he was fighting against. But the unity of Rome and Carthage was very important as a beachhead against this growth of oligarchism and evil during the days of the Roman kingship period, as well as the early Republic of Rome. But when the First Punic War began around 250 BC, things got ugly. And when Carthage was annihilated, Carthage didn't have a super strong military. That's what Rome was known for. Their expertise was in culture and commerce. But because of that, they fell for a few traps. They were basically undone quite badly and viciously, because while they wanted a peaceful outcome, and as peaceful as one could expect in the Third Punic War in 149 to 46 BC, the Scipio, who was one of the key agents of Rome, basically said, Carthage, we're going to take no surrender here. It's going to be all or nothing. And they surrendered their weapons. They were willing to make huge concessions to Rome, but Rome basically said, no, we don't want your concessions. We don't want your white flags. And they proceeded to just destroy every man over the age of 12 was killed. Everyone else, children and women, were sold into slavery. The city was razed to the ground in the capital, and Carthage was wiped out. But the question is, what was Britain here? What was the British Empire? Basically, if you take the lesson here is, don't be the type of good-willed, civilizational force that Carthage was trying to be by having a peaceful outcome. Don't rely on purely honest commerce or city building. Be the strongest. Don't go that way. And what was the greatest force, the greatest threat to the British Empire, all empires of Europe? Well, it was, again, the type of thing that was being composed into music by Beethoven in his Ninth Symphony, by Schiller's poetry, the type of spirit of revolution from a Republican revolution that we were talking about. Not anarchy, not chaos for its own sake, but something really specific. So Cooper has something to say about this. Oh, no. I fear something bad is happening once again.
Pat, just
Yeah.
close the PowerPoint maybe and reload it, because I think that might have worked on.
Can you see the PowerPoint right now?
PowerPoint, yes.
Yes.
You can see
Yes.
it? Okay. Okay. All right. So Cole makes a point in a letter to a friend that Turner, upon having returned from Europe in 1832 and describing the different paintings in France and Italy and in Britain especially, he says Turner is the prince of the evil spirits. With imagination and a deep knowledge of the machinery of his art, he has produced some surprising specimens of effects. His earlier pictures are really beautiful and true, though rather misty. But his late works, you see the most splendid combinations of color in chiaroscuro, which is basically the art of balancing light and darkness. Gorgeous, altogether false. There is a visionary, unsubstantial look about them that, for some subjects, is admirably appropriate. In pictures representing scenes of the world, in this world, rocks should not look like sugar candy, nor the ground like jelly. These opinions of existing English art I know may be considered heterodox, but I will venture them because I believe them correct. The standard by which I form my judgment is beautiful nature, and if I am astray, it is on a path which I have taken for that of truth. So he's saying something kind of controversial. Just like today, it's not, you're not supposed to criticize art. It was a little bit more normalized then, but still kind of controversial, especially art that the masses have been taught that they should admire. That's dangerous to do. So he's doing it anyway. But I didn't see anything particularly evil in Turner. Sorry, my thing's about to fall. So let's go see what he's talking about. He says the early Turner, and I think what we just saw with the Carthage two-piecer is still qualifies as early, is beautiful, deep knowledge. But with knowledge comes great power, and great power can be done for destructive or constructive ends. So let's some quick examples of early Turner when he was young. You know, he's born in 1775. Showcase the Calais, a storm, Calais, and you know you have obviously very, very strong exposition of people at a stormy sea in 1803 and 1776. I don't know. Basically, it's morning among the Coniston Falls. Again, very beautiful little piece of landscape, and another early piece, still in his 20s, 21, Fisherman at Sea. Inspired, obviously, by an English painter named Joseph Wright of Derby. Very strong with the moonlight, waves. I mean, there's a huge technical and a very strong mood is communicated, right? It's undeniable. So both technically strong. I'm keeping it on a small. I don't want to maximize it because it's shutting down the computer. It freezes it up. The pictures, the images that I picked are so heavy. I think it's causing the PowerPoint to shut down. So I'll maximize it one more time. And another Turner piece, 1802, was Lake Geneva in Mont Blanc. Again, very, very beautiful little piece. You know, very scenic. Some cows chilling, people relaxing on a beach. It's a nice piece. Got a nice mood. I'm not sure if there's anything specifically being communicated as an idea, but it still shouldn't appreciate what the painting does. But then something weird happens. Around 1810, something strange begins happening in Turner's art. And Turner has tens of thousands of paintings. He started producing faster and faster as he got older. And he's got about 3 stages in his painting career. But something really nuts. This is the first figure ever recorded of a painter who actually can showcases a giant boulder destroying a house with people in it. That's never been done before. And there's portrayal of an actual avalanche that killed a lot of people in, I think, a Swiss village, house being destroyed. And then things get increasingly more, he becomes more fixated on destruction. Above is a picture of another landslide destroying another Swiss village. This time it's playing much more with cadmium yellows and reds and oranges, very much playing with light a lot of death going on there, obviously. Eruption of Vesuvius, 1817, slightly earlier piece, but again, knowing that story, everybody in that scene is pretty much going to die. That's another thing. So, nothing wrong with doing a volcano, nothing wrong with painting a painting of things that involve people dying, but it's the question of the intensity of interest, and it gets more and more chaotic, and also more and more deconstructed in a sense. Less can one see actual forms in his paintings. Morning After the Deluge, after the Great Flood, is you can barely recognize anything except for the slight figure of what might be an angel, or I'm not really too sure what, and what appears to be a staff. Not really much in there. And what looks to be like maybe the portrayal of little blotches representing maybe heads. But again, very difficult to make out any of that. 1842, he paints the Snowstorm, one of his most famous pieces. Ship basically in a snowstorm at sea. There seems to be a castle in the background, a Fort Mignon of a ship that's sinking. Now, here's one thing that's interesting. A character is going to arise in our story right now who's sort of like an anti-Schiller. Just like I went through Schiller and his aesthetics and his influence in the arts and sciences, John Ruskin is sort of an anti-Schiller. This is going to be the topic of a future class or series of classes because Ruskin is so important. We're going to see more of him. But he has one little anecdote, since he's also known as the Turner's bulldog. Turner was he was deconstructing so much in his time in the 1820s, 30s, 40s that even in Britain, in the heart of the beast, people didn't have the aesthetic sensibilities. They were resisting the type of changes he was bringing into the arts. So he wasn't getting good reception. And John Ruskin comes out full force as his personal bulldog. We'll say more about that. And writes even books and champions Turner as like the greatest of all poets. He literally says he's the greatest of all poets and painters that ever could have been and ever will be. He talks at length about this. But he has an anecdote describing that specific piece, the Snowstorm, that John Ruskin took his mother to see this display. And he describes how, when speaking to Turner after his mom left, he says, I told him, Turner, he would not guess which had caught my mother's fancy, and then named the picture. And Turner, then said, I did not paint it to be understood, but I wished to show what such a scene was like. I got the sailors to lash me to the mast to observe it. I was lashed for 4 hours, and I did not expect to escape. But I felt bound to record it if I did. But no one had any business to like the picture. No one had any business to like the picture. But, said I, my mother once went through just such a scene and brought it all back. It brought it all back to her. Is your mother a painter? No. Then she ought to have been thinking of something else. These were nearly his words. I observed at the time he used record and painting as the title author had struck me before. John Ruskin. And his mom had been through something very similar, and that's why she really resonated to that painting. And you could just see, what's this guy's attitude? What's his heart? What type of character of a heart does that showcase? That's actually angry that somebody liked his painting. What type of technique is it that he felt that to paint something, he had to physically be there and sensually experience every moment in order to portray it just that way? This is Ruskin is not giving this anecdote in his book on the modern painters to criticize Turner. He's doing this to celebrate what a genius Turner is. That's why he's saying the anecdote that he's saying right now. There's some other examples of just deconstruction. Turner started pumping out paintings. Like I said, these things sell these days for hundreds of millions of dollars. But he's pumping these things out like multiple times a day. New Moon at Venice. He spent a lot of time at Venice. He loved Venice. He was totally inspired by the Gothic medieval architecture. There's Norham's Castle at Sunrise. Obviously, that's Norham's Castle at Sunrise. Basically, it's a very luminous, dreamy, sleepy state. A lot of chaos, like I said. Continues on. Burning of Parliament. He did a bunch of renditions of this live on sites. And it blends into his idea of industrialism. His work on whenever he portrays a train, it's not trains were brand new back in the 1830s, 40s, but rather than trying to celebrate it or see something optimistic in the bending of space and time, he always tends to portray them in a very ugly, dark way, as if it's really just, industrialization infringing upon nature, which is exactly how Ruskin sees it. Ruskin is somebody who, we're going to look at this, and I think of him as the anti-Schiller, because if you read his writings on aesthetics, and there's a lot of them, he's a lot of it sounds nice. He talks just like Schiller does, that the poet and the artist is responsible for the moral development of society. He says those things. He says art must be true, not contrived. He said, all of these nice things. It's hard to find things that are really that scary in what he says, but he inspired Cecil Rhodes. So he's the leader of founder of what was known as the pre-Raphaelite movement. He's the sponsor, and like I said, Turner's bulldog. So as Thomas Huxley was to Charles Darwin, John Ruskin was to Turner. He was, as I said, grand strategist of the Round Table movement, a teacher at Oxford of young Cecil Rhodes and Milner. Rhodes carried the writings that he transcribed of Ruskin every day of his life for 40 years in his breast pocket as he was working on subduing Africa and basically building up an international secret society centered in Oxford and calling it the Round Table movement for a reason. Ruskin was the Slade professor at Oxford. He was the co-founder of the Working Men's College in London, which grew into the First International as well, by the way. That's a little interesting side note. He directly had two newspapers, the People's Paper, which employed Karl Marx as its primary author of All Things Political Economy in 1850. And he was part of the whole Mazzini networks, too, that were trying to co-opt the revolutionary atmosphere that was spreading across Europe and channel it towards essentially color revolution. So induce the disenfranchised, use mobs into anarchy and mob rule in order to break the structures of governments that you don't like. Instead, and just take away the question of the moral and epistemological development of the people that would be required for them to self-rule. Because that's always it. You can't have sovereignty if you don't have that epistemological development of the soul to a state of high maturation through the arts. So if you don't have that and you just have mob rule, you have essentially the flip side of tyranny. It's just because the mob will always just take on the convictions and passions of the oligarchy that can manipulate them. That has always been the case. It's not a new thing. So in one of his lectures to Cecil Rhodes that Cecil Rhodes cited, he said, "There is a destiny now possible to us, the highest ever set before a nation to be accepted or refused. Will you, youths of England," being Cecil Rhodes in that audience, "make your country a royal throne of kings, a scepter island for all the world, a source of light, a center of peace?" And when he says peace, he just means stability, the crushing of all change. So it's not the type of peace we're talking about. So Ruskin, talking about Turner and foreseeing the future of the arts, he says all great modern artists will owe their obligation to Turner as a guide. They will, but they are in error in this gratitude, as I was when I quoted it as a sign of their respect. Close analysis of the portions of modern art founded on Turner has since shown me that in every case his imitators misunderstood him, that they caught merely at superficial brilliances and never saw the real character of his mind or his work. This isn't 1843. This is actually 1873. I screwed up on the date. Sorry. So what makes Ruskin so interesting to the story? Well, Ruskin situates the apex, his ideal of art, and this is why he called it the pre-Raphaelite society, is the age of pre-Renaissance. He sees specifically Venice, 14th century Venice, as the apex of all arts that all artists forever should always ideal, is the art of Venice, of 14th century Venice, pre-Renaissance. And here's one part from his the Venetian Stones book called where he says, "I wish the reader to remember the date 1301 as marking the commencement of a great architectural epoch in which took place the first appliance of the energy of aristocratic power and of the Gothic style to the works of the ducal palace. The operations then begun were continued with hardly an interruption during the whole period of the prosperity of Venice." So again, for people who have read my book or on the Anglo-Venetian roots of the deep state, should have some red alarms here when somebody talks the way that he's talking about. Because what is the ducal palace? Venice was the place that was selected by the oligarchy of Rome as the primary new base of operations as they reconstructed their collapsed Roman Empire in the lagoons of the armpit of Italy. Some displays on the ducal palace feature the Doge, the Lion of Venice, as sort of a retooled Babylonian lion figure. And this is what Ruskin, and there's no tree, no park, no green space anywhere in Venice. It's canals with dead bodies in it, a bunch of medieval architectural Gothic gargoyles and things of that sort. Certainly better than the cold crap that came out of architecture in the 1970s, but obviously there's still something a bit fishy here. That denote the morality of the new center of evil that had dominated the world for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it was really it only began to become undone with the advent of the Renaissance itself, led by Florence of France, a better England of the 15th century. And so, Ruskin continued to speak about the early sculptors of the ducal palace represents the state of Gothic work in Venice at its proudest period, around 1350. After this time, all is decline. Of what nature and by what steps we shall inquire in the ensuing chapter. For as this investigation, though still referring to Gothic architecture, introduces to the first symptoms of the Renaissance influence. And he always speaks of the Renaissance period, that period, where human beings started leaping beyond the limits to growth and living longer, and you have these massive explosions of new discoveries and inventions and new types of beauty expressed. That period he refers to as a plague, a symptom, a disease in all of his writings. He says here, the most precious work of any noble painter are usually those which have been done quickly and in the heat of the first thought, on a large scale, for places where there was little likelihood of their being well seen, or for patrons from whom there was little prospect of remuneration, money. Works thus executed are, of course, despised on account of their quantity as well as of their frequent slightness in the places where they exist. And they are too large to be portable, and are too vast and comprehensive to be read on the spot. In the hasty temper of the present age, they are therefore almost universally neglected, whitewashed by custodes, shot at by soldiers, suffered to drop from the walls, piecemeal in powder and rags by the society in general. But which is an advantage more than counterbalancing all this evil, since they are not often restored. What is left of them, however fragmentary, however ruinous, however obscured and defiled, is almost always the real thing. There are no fresh readings, and therefore the greatest treasures of art which Europe at this moment possesses are pieces of old plaster on ruinous brick wall, where the lizards burrow and bask, and which few other living creatures ever approach, and torn sheets, dim canvas, in waste corners of churches, in mildewed stains. So his ideal of proper art is the destroyed residues of half-assed art, which were done in haste, without much thought or work or effort, and which are now left in obscurity and destruction. That's what he thinks is the ideal state of good art. That's wild. So he goes on, and he's basically, this is actually useful. He says the rationalists kept the arts and cast aside the religion. This rationalistic art is art commonly called Renaissance, marked by a return to pagan systems. Instantly degradation followed in every direction. So basically, I'm not going to read it because we have to move on. But basically, he identifies the exact moment of the apex of corruption of art, which is the 1509 to 1511 period that Raphael Sanzio, the student of Leonardo da Vinci, is commissioned to redo the entirety of the Stanza della Signatura, the room in the Vatican in Rome where all of the legal treaties are signed. Raphael, the new up-and-coming artist of Florence, is brought in to redesign all of this. And he says this is the moment of maximum decay, of maximum corruption, because Raphael allowed portrayals of Jesus Christ to coexist alongside portrayals of the Greeks, of Plato, of Homer, of Apollo. And he says because this coexistence, where they were allowed to somehow be treated with respect at the same time, that caused the decadence and corruption of the Renaissance and the loss of our Christianity, the loss of our moral principles. Says the guy who believes that the ideals of art be decay. So anyway, this is one angle of the Stanza della Signatura of Raphael, featuring the School of Athens. This is the Mount Parnassus, which is the mythical mountain of the gods, featuring the 9 muses, the 9 ancient poets. Homer is there. Apollo now being portrayed as a god of poetry or creativity. In this particular instance, is in the center, surrounded by his muses. You've got Dante Alighieri down there. So you have that on one wall. And then on another wall, you have the disputation of the Holy Sacrament, the Christ above and the saints, and down below you have various popes. You have actually Raphael paints himself in there as well, the same distance from Pope Innocent III, who's not so innocent when you actually get to know who he is and how he was the Crusader Pope that almost destroyed the world, who actually launched what was known as the Fourth Crusade, that established the hegemony of Venice over Constantinople in 1201 to 1204. You have Thomas Aquinas, who justified the idea that the papacy should be also the temporal controller of the world, who's standing right beside him. That was Thomas Aquinas's defenses of the papal rights to control the material world, which were sort of an add-on to the fallacious donation of Constantine earlier. So the fact that Raphael would portray himself both in a paper pope hat at the same distance away from this Holy Sacrament as you have Pope Innocent the Third, is interesting. You have the founder of the Dominican movement, which becomes the heart of the Inquisition. You have Pope Sextus the Fourth as well, who's the founder of the Inquisition, brought in here. And there's a lot of richness in this particular mural. There's a lot we're not going to go through today because this is a whole class on this. But I'm just pointing out a few anomalies. You have the dispute between Plato and Aristotle, featuring a temporal sort of what LaRouche had called the simultaneity of eternity, as a good example of sort of what Morse had done earlier with the painting of the Louvre, with all of these people who didn't exist, or who weren't living or weren't around at the same time, sort of now living and embodying a sort of one moment in a painting. Same thing's happening here with people separated by centuries, all coexist, arguing with each other, with very clear messaging by Raphael of the dichotomy, the opposing paradigm, Plato and Aristotle in the center. The roof is also part of it. The ceiling has a lot going on, featuring theology, justice, philosophy, poetry, all being expressed in the various circles. There's a lot more, again, to unpack. But this room is one symphony. It's one composition. Now, Ruskin hates it. He says, from that spot, from that moment that Raphael did this, and from that hour, the intellect and the art of Italy date their degradation. And it was brought about in great part by the very excellencies of the man who had thus marked the commencement of the decline. the perfection of execution and the beauty of feature which were attained in these works and in those of his greatest contemporaries rendered finish of execution and beauty of form the chief objects of all artists. And henceforward execution was looked for rather than thought, and beauty rather than veracity. So basically all he's saying in his own pompous way is that because Raphael did what he did, he made something so beautiful that it is untrue because he didn't recognize reality as it was. He tried to impose ideals into art to transform humanity. And he says so explicitly. And because he made it so high, this quality of beauty, that it could go nowhere down. It couldn't get any better, he says. And so because of that, it is the cause of all decay and degradation of the arts. All right, just put that aside for a second. He continues by criticizing Raphael, saying Raphael was a painter of humanity, and assuredly there is something the matter with humanity. Raphael had something to mend in humanity. I should have liked to see him mend a daisy. So I mean, it's clear where his ideals are, right? He's basically of a cynical, typical view that man cannot be mended. We are intrinsically a broken thing. That's our nature, is to be corrupt and broken. And instead of trying to waste our time with fancies that we could do that, we should be just focusing on the little things. Paint daisies. Be true to ourselves by being true to nature. Just paint the details. Be realistic. Don't be idealistic. It's essentially the theology and morality of Aristotle embodied in a 19th century imperial, pretty much. And again, he says it does not much matter that an individual loses 200 or 300 pounds in buying a bad picture, but it is to be regretted that a nation should lose 200,000 or 300,000 in raising a ridiculous building. Nor is it merely wasted wealth or distempered conception which we have to regret in this Renaissance architecture. But we shall find in it partly the root, partly the expression of certain dominant evils of modern times. Over-sophistication and ignorant classicism, the one destroying the healthfulness of general society, the other rendering our schools and universities useless to a large number of the men who pass through them. So this is a guy, again, he ran the Working Men's Association, of the Working Men's University, or college. This is a proto-Fabian so-called social school, calling for what later became, again, a return to simplicity, giving everyone access to their little mini local cultures. That actually became the arts and crafts movement of the 1880s that he founds. Basically saying culture should not be something that's unattainable. It should be something that all of us can do. And that's true. That's true. There's nothing wrong with this. But he basically says we should do this at the expense of ideals of excellence. Basically making culture mediocre, makes it accessible to all, democratizes it. But at the same time as he supports democracy, he also believes that the world should be run by a king with godlike powers that would manage the stability of the whole world. He believes that too. So how does this guy who's celebrated as a man of the people in that sense also go on to promote the idea of restoration of a global Venice and a center command with a rule by a godman at the helm, right? It's wild, the amount of mental gymnastics that some people go through. This is the last quote by Ruskin, where he says, "It is in Venice, therefore, and in Venice only, that effectual blows can be struck at this pestilent art of the Renaissance. Destroy its claims to admiration there, and it can assert them nowhere else. This, therefore, will be the final purpose of the following essay." And then he goes on and he writes his Stones of Venice essay. Now, I had a quote by James Fenimore Cooper, and I'm just going to read one because this class is going to go on forever if I read it all. But people should read his Bravo. Cynthia gave a wonderful lecture on Cooper with a focus on his Bravo as an expose of the evils of Venice as the center command structure of global intelligence operations that had taken over Britain. Cooper was wise to this. Schiller was wise to this. This is actually in Schiller's Ghost Seer. He places Venice at the center of the evil that was profiling and deconstructing a high-value target in the form of a young, soft-minded German prince who vacationed in Venice and was deconstructed by careful operations that Schiller weaves for us. Again, Cynthia did another class on this too, which we should just put these in the description of the video. But Cooper basically says Venice, though ambitious and tenacious of the name of a republic, was in truth a narrow, a vulgar, and an exceedingly heartless oligarchy, because it called itself the Serene Republic, but it was a republic in name only, and it gave republics a bad name. To the former title, she had no other claim than her denial of the naked principle already mentioned, while her practice is liable to the reproach of the two latter, in the unmanly and narrow character of its exclusion, in every act of her foreign policy and in every measure of her internal policy. At the period of which we write, Italy has had several self-styled commonwealths, in not one of which, however, was there ever a fair and just confiding of power into the body of the people, though perhaps there is not one that has not been cited sooner or later in proof of the inability of man to govern himself. So basically, these fake republics have been set up throughout Italy. Geneva also or Genoa was an example of this too, that are designed to be a masquerading tyranny. And every time they fall apart, then the oligarchs and aristocrats and everybody say, see, this is why we can't have republics. They never work. Well, it's not a really republic. It's based upon an oligarchical system. And he goes through and names the family structure. He names the techniques. Again, read the Bravo or listen to Cynthia's class or both. So Thomas Cole doesn't believe any of it. He doesn't believe in obviously truth by pure empiricism, which is the Ruskin pre-Raphaelite school. He believes in a different idea, a higher idea of truth, because he's never seen this. This is called the dream of the architect. And he places an architect who's fallen asleep and dreaming after having done serious research, holding a blueprint in his hand of a grandiose Egyptian fusion of a Greek and of a Roman architectural system, along with a little tip of the hat to the medieval structures as well, surrounded by forest. Which, I mean, there's a certain warmth and a light inside, and it has a lot to do with Christianity. I mean, Cole was a very devoutly Christian person, and so even though he wasn't a big fan of medieval architecture, Gothic architecture, there was still something valuable in it that shouldn't be discarded. But I think that was also why he placed it in shadows too, in a bit of a silhouette here. But again, this is both true. He's both utilizing a true devotion to nature, while at the same time it's imagination blending to communicate something to the audience. And you have it framed also in sort of you as the audience are part of the painting, because you're placed within the framing of the porticos of these columns with a drapery that's been pulled aside, almost like you're looking at a stage, right? You're looking into the mind of this dreaming architect. This question of transforming nature, there's a 4-part series that Cole did as well, both showcasing a beautiful understanding of atmospheric perspective, aerial perspective, nature, the way Da Vinci did, but also showcasing the human quality. This is the course of life on the stage of youth. Another one, at infancy, at youth, as the youth is going off with visions and hope for a world, of justice and all sorts of ideals are bursting at the seams. The angel, who had formerly been very close to the happy baby sitting in flowers in the little golden canoe, has taken a step back, right? As the child is now a bit more sovereign. The world is still very, very hopeful, but things happen. And this is at manhood. And you can see that journey is going to get rocky. And we've all been there. And the angel is still in the picture, but far enough far enough removed in the clouds at this point, watching, but really allowing a lot of freedom to the person at young manhood to make their mistakes. And towards the end of life, now you have that person's guardian angel, again, very allegorical, at the end of life, guiding him to the end of the journey. Now, people could get a variety of things out of this, but obviously coming through that period when you've experienced these 4 things, knowing that the problem of democracies turning into mob rule and a republic turned into a state of corruption such that it becomes empire, such that it collapses, as all empires must, has a lot to do with the lack of ability of individuals to come to terms with the reality of their mortality. That's a fact of that's a demonstrable fact. When people are not able to internalize the fact of their ultimate finiteness in order to then think of what would be their higher purpose as beings that are granted and gifted a certain period in time, in space and time within the universe, what's the purpose of life? If people don't tackle that question, then they're not going to be able to access those higher sentiments, the higher reason that Schiller, that Goethe, to a certain, but especially Humboldt and Cooper are all working to help people get to. And, you know, Thomas Cole's done a lot of other too. He's not just doing these grandiose paintings, but, you know, he's done other forms of landscape. Some landscape is more normal than others. This one I think is beautiful, in the Connecticut River Valley in 1836. And, you know, it's an actual true to life painting, but it's a little bit, there's some ambiguity again. The question of the storm and the positive weather, right? Which came first? Is the storm coming on? Or did the storm already through? If it's coming on, then why is the painter not leaving? Because if you get down there and you look, that he actually includes himself looking at the audience painting the scenery. Also, if the storm is coming and hasn't already hit, then why are the trees already destroyed by a storm? So it seems clear that the storm has in fact actually passed through, but then, you know, when you look at the area where this painter is painting, it hasn't really been hit. The sun is hitting. There's agriculture going on. You know, it's a very big painting, so you miss the details. And that painter wouldn't have been sitting out there under that storm. So there's some ambiguity again, to leave the mind open to think a little bit about what's being said. These things are allegorical, but they're not whatever. There's not just anything goes. There's another very nice painting of Florence when Cole was in Italy. You know, he painted the Santa Maria del Fiore, some people just, you know, being people, chilling, playing some musical instruments. But he definitely saw, unlike Ruskin, Florence and the best of the Renaissance was something to emulate and then improve upon in America. Now, I want people to remember the 5-part series we saw, The Course of Empire? There's something in it that was never resolved, which was what is the solution to break the empire? To break from the fall of empire. Well, break from becoming an empire, and then break from falling and collapsing as an empire must. This is, I think, a very important component. If you remember the previous scenes of the 5-part series, I should have kept it going, eh? So we always had that same mountain. Okay. We always had that same mountain in the background. There in every single scene. Right? But the thing looking in the case of all of the course of this civilization took to their downfall was the question of Prometheus, which a year before Cole dies, he does 2 different renderings of Prometheus. One of them being on a rock, which looks very similar to the rock that we saw at the tip of the mountain in the Course of Empire series. The Promethean principle is the very principle of the Hudson River School that he founds, along with a grouping of other artists. And that's the thing, that if you don't have a civilization that's capable of bringing about the Promethean spark of what Benjamin Franklin tapped into and what Cole and West tapped into, if you don't have that at every single generation being renewed, then you're in a situation where that society is always going to fall prey to oligarchical manipulation and a lot more. Now, due to the fact that I bit off way more than I could chew, since we are now at 1.5 hours of me going through a presentation, I'm thinking that, and we're only we still have technically 50 more slides. I'm thinking that this might be a good place to feasibly end it, depending on how people are feeling right now in the audience. I'll do a little teaser here. Cole had only one student in his life, though he did a lot. He was super hyperactive, and he died a bit early. Actually, he died of strange circumstances in some ways, around the same time as Edgar Allan Poe died, who were corresponding with each other and both working on cultural warfare against oligarchical operations. That's a story that has to be uncovered. I just started noticing these connections as I was doing this research. I find it very interesting. But he had one student that he worked very closely with named Friedrich Edwin Church. And Church had his tightest collaborator in the form of a German immigrant. There were 4.5 million Germans who emigrated between 1815 and 1850 from Germany to America. Pretty much because the Humboldt-Schiller cultural environment that induced the society with such a love of beauty and freedom was not made very welcomed, to say that, by the age of the restoration of the oligarchies and the ultimate culture of censorship that had dominated Europe, especially from 1815 to 1850, 1860, under things like the Carlsbad decrees that had put censors in every college, had made sure that no professor was going to be allowed to teach if they permitted their students to have ideas that were not in conformity with the oligarchical value system. Works were not allowed to be performed musically. You couldn't play Beethoven. You couldn't read Percy Shelley's Prometheus Unbound. Most publications were not allowed to print those things. So it was a real culture of psycho-spiritual strangulation, which caused these creative people. That was a blessing in some ways for the young America that needed quality people at a time when their own population was becoming stupid and decadent, around especially Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, coming in and infusing certain Schillerian principles in science and in the arts. Alexander von Humboldt played a role, like I said, in all of this. So Albert Bierstadt, who formerly had been a part of the Dusseldorf Academy in Westphalia, also came in, played a key role, organizing the Hudson River School alongside Friedrich Church. And we're going to make this our next presentation at some undefined moment in the future. And then we're going to revisit what the hell happened to this Hudson River School that was so powerful for about 50 years, especially up until about 1870. It was like the dominant school. Here's a couple quick samples by Church. Just a couple of quick samples of the work that Church did in South America, and Ecuador, and Colombia during the time, actually, of the Peruvian-Ecuadorian War, which was a British-manipulated war, and Frederick Edwin Church went down for those years that was happening, and even a bit before that, to try to make sure that the war didn't happen, and that the Republican forces, who were of a higher quality, but also some of the Marquis forces who were of a higher quality, since there were good people on both sides, were not played into going and slaughtering each other unnecessarily, as the British had worked so hard to prepare the groundwork for in the years leading up to this situation. And the young Mazzini networks, the young Europe movements were not just for Europe. There was young American movements that were built up around the networks of Ruskin, including Thomas Carlyle, who was a main controller of the new movement around Emerson called the Transcendentalists, who all tend to be also tied in with the pre-Raphael school in America. You have in the South a branch of the Young America movement in the form of Albert Pike's networks, have their own flavor of Young America, but for the South. You have across South America, Latin America, Ibero-America, I should say, you have a similar young Ibero-America movements being coordinated by British intelligence and a variety of Masonic operations, which people like Melville, as I've just discovered, Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick, was not just an author of Moby Dick. He was actually fighting and exposing the networks running these young Europe and young American operations, including one of Marx's key handlers in the form of David Urquhart, who ran the British Museum, out of which Marx did a lot of work along with Ruskin. So you have a lot of these literary figures: Cooper, Edgar Allan Poe, Samuel B. Morse, Cole, Frederick Edwin Church, Bierstadt. They're not just the way if we know of them at all, it's only through a very superficial reading of some of their more popular works, if anything. And the actual content of what even gave those works existence is not known. Their political fight is not known. It's kept from us. But they're all part of this network to expose the hand of the cult of ugliness in all of its manifestations. Here's just a quick little display by Church in 1863 in the midst of the Civil War, featuring what seems to be a still life, a basic landscape, but it's not just your typical landscape of the Cotopaxis volcano in near the Andes. But you have a lot more poetry embedded in this, right? A classical Song Dynasty Chinese painter would see this and recognize a lot in this mode of communication of poetic thoughts in the form of visual expression. And the world had a lot to be scared of. America, especially in 1863, he was composing this, and he was a great patriot. So on the one hand, you know, he's speaking to the people, he's speaking to so much, and you can get what you get out of it. But I think we'll just end it there and go for like a little bit of open dialogue and see what people think. Everyone's, by the way, on mute by default. I'm really sorry about that. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat box, or put your hand up and Cynthia call on you accordingly.
You can also just stop maybe sharing your screen.
Oh, yeah. Right.
Oh, thank you, Matt. That was terrific. I learned so much. And I remember years ago, because I myself didn't really know how to think about painting until I visited the Met Museum in New York, which is a really spectacular museum, because it does make a difference when you see these things in person as well. But strangely enough, in Washington, D.C., of all places, was like a really great experience in like looking at architecture that had a loving type of morality, where it was just this constant reminder of a better time in the United States. And it just makes it even more sad what Washington, D.C. has become, because all of these politicians are constantly reminded about their heritage and the founding principles in the architecture. And they're constantly surrounded with this beauty, and yet so many of them have become, you know, the disappointments that they are. But it was a really amazing experience in Washington, D.C. as well. And it just goes to show what, you know, Matt is talking about in terms of this cultural warfare, being in the paintings, they have museums in Washington, D.C., and in the architecture and the sculpture. So, yeah, Matt had about an hour, I think, left of slides. And I think he also is welcoming the idea of doing a part 2, because he did a lot of work kind of like over the past 2 days. And I think it needs to also sort of go through a bit more processing, but super interesting. I learned a lot. Does anybody have any questions?
I see Adria's hand.
Yeah.
Everyone is on mute as usual, so you have to take yourselves off mute.
First of all, I'd like to just take a moment to also thank Cynthia for her recent presentations. I haven't been able to comment, but I've enjoyed your presentation so much. I'm learning so much. It's just such I'm so grateful. Thank you. It's almost too much to take in, the amount of information, so forgive me, but there's so many things I could say, but one thing that would come to mind would be, what are your thoughts on the impact of the Catholicism versus the Protestant kind of ethic? You know, the genres, as you well know, for art were established by the patrons of art, and traditionally the patrons were either the royals, as you mentioned, the Louvre, or the church. And then you have in the Protestant Reformation and during the Reformation, you have the Dutch and Flemish, now Belgium countries, Belgium aligned with Spain and the Flemish state, with these kind of, the subjects that were material subjects, or not religious, the secularization of art. And that secularization of art was, quite influential on the French Impressionists and Impressionist school. But this is the inheritance of this kind of landscape, and it is the Barbizon school of landscape that I think really informs, maybe even, I don't know if it's equal. It is a contemporary of the Hudson River School, or at least the first generation Hudson River School. I would want to ask what the role of that would be, especially with the pre-Raphaelite, the attack of Raphael and the Vatican paintings, and this notion that the system of perspective, whether it's aerial perspective or, the whole thing, linear perspective, that it was, such an apex in art that the only way to get beyond that technique would be to create something spiritual or something, ideological. You have Hunt, who was the William Holt, what was his name? William Hunt.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was the head of the Raphaelites, or, really one of the major painters of that school. And he painted the image, I think it's called The Light of the World. It's a painting of Christ. And, this is a version of it hangs at Oxford University. And it people of the Protestant faith really regard this as a very religious, it's like, what is the religious, Protestant versus Catholic thing going on with this kind of critique? The Americans, whether it's Cole or even Church, I think Church was a Congregationalist. He came from a Congregationalist, that's to say Calvinist family. What is the role of secularization or the Protestant ethic in the subject, or the veneration of nature and landscape? When you go back to Zen and people like that, they're depicting nature as Arcadia in like a myth, and they're telling mythological stories. And to the extent that the painting is really about nature, it's also about these myths. Whereas a landscape where the divine is embodied in nature is like a deist or a transcendentalist ethic. That's really quite different. So I'm sorry, I probably didn't make any sense, but
that's totally. No, I appreciate it. It was a very, very, very informed exposition and slash question, and I appreciate it a lot. And I think you're gonna really get a lot out of part 2, which will go deep into the Barbizon movement from Fontainebleau. Bleu. And we're gonna look at some works by Jean-François Millet and in the case of America, we'll look at some of Jervis McEntee and George Innes's work as well. But we're also going to make a point that utilizing firsthand literature knowledge and looking at some of the underappreciated fights behind the scenes, we're also going to observe that the Barbizon school was the destruction of the Hudson River School. It was a subversion of it, with political objectives associated with it, tied to very powerful forces who wanted to take techniques that are useful, like finishing techniques that are useful in lighting or sfumato, and rather than use them as techniques, but overinflate their purpose to create effects of melancholia. In the case of the American expression of the Luminist school, right? Because I mean, it had different expressions in France or in France versus America. But in the case of America, it took elements of the Hudson River School, like I said, the luminism, the finishing, and then it just made that the painting, and it created a creation of a dreaminess, a woozy dreaminess, a surreality. But that surreality, which had a whole ideological justification for that, created a counterpole, as it must, with an opposing new school that also subverted Hudson River School, because it's always through these false dichotomies, controlled oppositions. You create one polarity, and you can then know that another polarity will arise to be played with, while those who are trying to modulate on the path of wisdom are dismantled in the left versus right stuff. It's typical. Do you care about the greater good, or do you care about individual liberty? Pick a side. Are you a Keynesian or are you an Austrian school? Pick a side. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Why can't we have maybe both being respected at the same time? So the opposing school was the school of hyper-realism, which also was known increasingly as the American pre-Raphaelites, and there's a variety of them, including William Sturgis, not all painters, Thomas Ferrer, who are painting things, and I'm not going to overtalk it, but basically hyper-realism versus hyper-dreamism, and both of them lost a certain spark of creative I guess you could say the divine was somewhat obscured in both, from the way that I'm talking, or that Schiller's talking about it. From the standpoint of your question on the religious component, it's a good question, but I think that from what I gather, it's all about keeping wisdom. What is wisdom? There's many definitions, but I think one wisdom, one is like the art of judging, the art of using discernment and judgment, right? And improving upon that. So not just it by itself as some finished art, but the ability to improve upon your tool of judgment to get better and better without ever being perfect, because that would make you God. So, and that partly involves as a secondary feature, well, knowing what place to give value to, not to give things that have less value, more value than they deserve. Everything has sort of a place, we see that very clearly as an example of, you could have a chicken, which is a living creature made of carbon, and you could have that for supper. But if you have a baby, and eat the baby, a human baby for supper, you should go to jail. There's something wrong with you. You should get psychiatric help. That's wrong. Whereas eating the chicken isn't necessarily wrong, even though they're both made of carbon and they were both alive. So we know that there's a hierarchy, and when somebody misplaces the value of something, and they become like a cannibal who will never eat a chicken, then you got a problem. So it's like that, I think, with the arts. In whether you are Catholic or whether you are Protestant, if you don't have that judgment, you will place God where God actually isn't found, and you'll miss God where God is found. Now, for people who are like Catholic or Protestant but with a pagan bent, they will tend to find all sorts of ways of placing God a bit everywhere. Like, God is this rock, God is this, God, rather than sort of trying to find a way to see that these are the effects of a creator. So why should the effects of the creator not have something divine within it? But it's not God that you're looking at. You're looking at the effects. So I think you're right. There was this, like, on the one hand, in some Catholic art, you find like a hypertrophied over iconoclasm or an over emphasis, almost propaganda-y, which doesn't give you a lot of space to think for yourself or to move your mind, which is just coming at you of like celebrate, this or that interpretation of the Bible or whatever. That's a bit heavy. It's not very free. And then in other cases, you had that response from the Protestant movement with a lot of the hyper-secularized Dutch work, which lacks the divine completely. But I like Rembrandt as some example of somebody who was Protestant, but yet who was able to then still give proper homage to the divine in Christ within a lot of his so-called secular works. And it didn't make the secular works less good that they didn't all have Christ in them, but he was able to walk the line and to find that balance in the way he did. Da Vinci, was living in a very Catholic world as well, but he was able to also sort of walk that balance. And I find Raphael sometimes a bit heavy, but still, it's all about balance. And whatever your denomination is, I find if you're looking for that in that way, as I believe Bierstadt and Cole and Church, they were striking the balance pretty well. They won't get it right all the time, but they're going to be pretty good. You'll be in a good path, I think. So that's how I think about it. I don't know. And
just one other brief comment is when you were talking about Ruskin's view of Venice and the landscape, Canaletto is the, major landscape painter, in the Italian kind of tradition, his seascapes, and they're all really based on perspective. I mean, they're very mathematical, the most mathematical of paintings. They're all architectural kind of paintings, and they're miniature, and they were very informed by his study of theater and opera design and all of that. And they're very theatrical, and they were made as like tourists to really mass produce and sell to tourists. So they're very mercantile as well. I don't know how that reconciles with Ruskin was saying about. I think Ruskin was just generalizing to talk about Turner's Venetian works, but the aesthetic that Ruskin was trying to express, this very kind of impromptu, modern, free-flowing, imaginative thing, it is exactly what he disparaged in Whistler's Nocturnes. So it seems quite hypocritical. It seems like, and Ruskin was very much a head case in his own personal life. It was very strange.
Yeah. No, and so was Turner. Was a massive head case too, but just much more closed off. But yeah, I mean, you said a lot of very important points. And again, we're gonna go through that a little bit more in part 2 of this class. But just for me to say one thing about this. You remember how Schiller was talking about the importance of a harmony of the parts with a one in any composition is sort of like you want the different parts to serve a whole, not to be disjointed. Oligarchical systems are disjointed intrinsically. They like Plato demonstrates in the Socratic dialogues, even though you have like what appears to be a nice, symmetrical, pretty argument, when you start poking it and asking very basic elementary questions, you could find that the argument itself dismantles itself. It's not like Plato is putting anything new to destroy the structure of the argument. He's simply asking questions to define terms or thoughts that were based upon false assumptions and have the false assumption break itself. So it breaks, the structure falls upon its own weak foundations that appeared strong only to naive sense perception. Ruskin is very much like that. All oligarchical systems and subparts, as far as like individuals who are grand strategists serving the operating system of oligarchy, the right of the few to rule over the many independent of their wisdom, right? Just because they're hereditarily endowed with certain genetics, that's why all of a sudden, you get the right last name for a family. That's why. No, there will be things that will contradict. And in Ruskin, he's all full of contradictions. He talks about liberty of every individual and freedom and truth and art. He talks about these things, and yet he goes and supports political systems that are tyrannical. He supports forms of art that are lazy, at the same time as he at other times supports hyper rigor, hyper realism, hyper detail in other forms of art. He says he doesn't like the oh my God, there's so many things. We'll talk more about Ruskin next week, I promise. Yeah. Anybody else?
Yeah, Jerry has a question or a comment in defense of the Gothic, and then I think Stephen Hoffman has a question.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Oh, that was a wonderful class, Matt. I really, really enjoyed that. Especially the quotes of Schiller at the start. I wish I could have had them for last week. You kind of put an end to my class, but no, I had studied a lot of Cole's paintings, but I'd never really seen any of his writing. You had some wonderful quotes of his, which is in total opposition to Ruskin. And this Ruskin, he comes across like he's he's anti-Renaissance and trying to say he's pro-Gothic, which I find to be a total fraud because, well, every time I go to Europe, and you should do it too when you go, I like going to a town and I go to their church and I like studying their architecture, especially the Gothic churches. And I found these Gothic churches are beautiful. And the more I read about them, it really seems this whole Gothic architecture came out of Charlemagne and that whole period and development that took place under him. And the Gothic cathedrals especially were really used as a way to educate the population, to uplift them. And as they were building these cathedrals, the next one they built, they tried to make higher than the last one. And they got to a point where they couldn't go any higher because the weight of it would collapse it. So there was kind of a limit to the Gothic. But then with the Renaissance, they developed, these turrets they had on the side of them so they could go even higher. And even like with the cathedral in Florence, they built this beautiful cathedral, but they couldn't figure out how to do the dome. And I've always thought of the Renaissance as a continuation of the Gothic, sort of solving the problems, the limits they had. Whereas you have this Ruskin who tries to say they're separate. Oh, this is Gothic, this is Renaissance, they're classified different, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And that's what I really dislike about Ruskin. And I wondered if you had the same idea or what you thought about that.
No, yeah, you're right. And you helped put some more meat on the bones of my thought because it was underdefined, but you're right. And I think the thing about Ruskin that's important to hold in mind is he's not talking about just any old Gothic or any old medieval architecture. He's specifically talking about Venetian Gothic. That's his entire devotion, which is a very peculiar type of Gothic because, well, if you look at a lot of the pictures of Venice, I've never been to Venice, but my aunt went there on vacation a couple of years ago, and she showed me all of the pictures, and I saw them. I saw a bunch of other ones. It's a weird place. It's a weird city, and so much of it has like a Byzantine structure. There's some Arabism. There's things that are just stolen from a bit of everywhere. Right? There's things that were a lot of the statues, a lot of the designs, the columns. Even they dismantled Constantinople in 1201 after the Fourth Crusade and just like looted it and brought a lot of it into St. Mark's Square. And so you have this weird disjointedness of things just being forced together as like trophies of having looted your enemies and rivals over the years of accumulation of like somehow the Venetians always won out, regardless of what crusade it was. Venetians like expanded their booty massively, and their state grew out of that. The ducal palace was shaped by a lot of these crusading wars. And you're right. There's something noble in the Gothic architecture intrinsically. It is got a quality to it which is good. And you pointed out that Charlemagne brought this into be. I didn't know that. I didn't know about the Charlemagne connection. That's something I want to look into more. And Venice, yeah, it's I guess it's all about the execution, right? Like if the intention shapes the material execution of any art or architecture. So yeah, I'd like to look at more Venetian architectures explicitly to see what are all of these elements that Ruskin loves so much, and then contrast it with some more honest displays of proper Gothic architecture done with an honest heart to make people better and serve as a workshop to elevate the minds of the people as we know that they did in the medieval times. That's definitely important. Yeah, that'd be a fun study.
Yes, and I just wanted to mention one other thing. One of these Gothic churches we went to, they had these like stone carvings, of a scene. But instead of having it on the wall for people to look at it, they had it on the floor. And we were wondering, what the hell are you putting it on the floor? It should be up on the wall. And then the the tour guide explained to us, no. They put them on the floor so that the peasants could come in, and somehow they got a hold of a piece of paper and a piece of coal, and they put the paper over the stone carving on the floor, and they would make like an etching, and they could take it home and therefore hang a painting up in their little shack or whatever. So I found that fascinating in terms of it really was designed to uplift the population. That's just a little story on the side, but yeah.
No, that's super useful.
Susan, did you have a question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Cynthia said that she thought this presentation needed a little bit more processing. And I wish you could save this recording and just go back to the beginning next week. And don't leave out all the comments that you cut out because you thought it was too much. Matthew, you have so much passion here. Bruce de Torres keeps talking about he thinks you're just a genius, but this is the wellspring that your genius comes from, this area of art and how you've developed yourself in this way. And all of the other topics that you discuss, the life of them is coming from this place in you. And in the very beginning, when you were talking about, what was his name? The artist that you were talking about in the Hudson Institute, I think.
Oh, not Hudson Institute. No, Hudson River School. Probably Samuel Morse.
Okay. But you could just feel in the explanations and the paintings you were describing the connecting of the different aspects of ourself and the inspiration and the uplifting of the human spirit, just all of these truths and areas of growth. And then when you brought in Turner, it's like something really damaged this man. And then Ruskin starts elevating this, and he's elevating chaos and darkness into like the universal psyche of mankind. And it just pollutes the streams of people's thinking and suppresses those ideas of inspiration and growth that were there before. And he really just created this whole fog that allowed the oligarchical system to build upon. But even as you're explaining this, you are cleansing those streams in the universal psyche. I'm sorry if I just sound like I'm really, really out there, but this is so powerful that you are cleansing those streams and uplifting inspiration and growth once again. So take all the time you need. This is very powerful. And this passion in you is what is helping to heal our universal consciousness.
Well,
keep going.
Okay, thank you. Oh, thanks, Susie. That was very, very inspired of you, and thank you so much for those kind words. I'll certainly do my best, and I'll recapitulate some of those thoughts for the next class that we went through at the beginning. They will be reminded. People will be reminded of that stuff, and it's going to become a bit of a wild ride. It'll be fun.
On that note, do you know when you will be doing part 2?
Well, the scheduling does make this a little bit tough. I might have to do it on a weekday evening or something like that, which is going to be crappy for our European friends, but I could probably do it like maybe the week after Kwan does his presentation this Wednesday, so I could do it in like maybe 2 Wednesdays. Because otherwise, the scheduling is pretty packed in for the next few months for Sundays.
Okay.
Quick note on American Gothic. One of the key figures of the American branch of the Pre-Raphaelite school, which otherwise known as like the Association for Truthfulness in Arts or something pretentious like that, was this guy Russell Sturgis. And Russell Sturges played a big role in pushing against the idea of Greco-Roman art in government buildings and things of that sort, and pushed instead for academy schools buildings to be of the more Gothic design instead. I got to look more into some of the fights. I've only sort of brushed up against them a little bit, but he was really much in opposition to the was it the Ithiel Home school of architecture, or Ithiel Town. That's it, not home, town. Who was the person? Ithiel Town was more the architect who was trying, as far as I understand it, to revive more the Greco-Roman program in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and he worked closely with Thomas Cole. And in fact, it was him who commissioned Thomas Cole to do that painting of the architect's dream. And he's like, I want something celebrating Greco art. And Thomas Cole was like, okay, I'll do something for you. But it was a little bit too creative for Ithiel Town. He's like, it's too much for me. I just wanted Greco. And he gave him like, Egyptian, Roman, and medieval and everything. And he's like, no, I just want the one. So he was a bit stiff. But there was a fight in America over what direction things would take. And I know the Pre-Raphaelites had their guy, Sturges, who was that was their champion of the Gothic approach, which ended up dominating at that point. So a lot I don't know about. I'm just, a lot of the stuff I just sort of like scratched on a little bit in my research in the last couple of days. So a lot more work needs to be done.
Well, I'm really happy. I agree with Susan. This is a very important subject, and you've been wanting to work on this for a long time. So it's great that Rising Tide gives us these challenges and opportunities to do research that otherwise we might not make the time for, but is really important. So great work, Matt, and looking forward to your second installment. For Sunday, February 5th, it will be Dr. Quan Le, who will be doing a lecture from the Ode to Oranges to the Night Banquet, depictions of an aristocratic soul and a plutocratic soul. So looking forward to that as well. And any closing thoughts, Matt, or?
Well, hopefully I placed a little hole in people's souls that they want to fill with something infinite, and hopefully that'll involve coming back to part 2 to continue this journey.
Great. Thank you, everybody.